Woohoo! Okay, public service drug class and drug class itself. I'm gonna wrap up these psychiatric meds lecture. I've in the past done this where I imitate having depression myself. It's not gonna fly online like this. I don't want folks to be worried about me. We are in the thick of the coronavirus. I'm doing fine. Don't want people to worry. I've also been accused of making light of mental illness in the past on these. I assure you, I devoted my whole life to clinical psychology, so I'm not bitter or mean or minimizing when it comes to psychopathology. I'm gonna basically just get into the last of the mood disorder treatments, including some alternative approaches, and really want to emphasize that there are both behavioral and cognitive interventions that are free of all the side effects inherent in the meds we've discussed, and they're definitely worth considering whenever folks are contemplating a pharmacological intervention for the disorders we have mentioned. I am not getting into anxiety. We did it when we did the sedatives, but some of these would generalize for generalized anxiety disorder at least. All right, away we go. So just wanted to introduce the idea of off-label use of these psychotropic meds. Once a medication has been approved by the FDA, you're a little fast and loose about some antidepressants being used to treat anxiety or some anti-anxiety drugs used to treat depression. This, more than anything, may say something about the discriminative validity of these diagnoses. It may not say so much about pharmacological interventions or even human bodies so much as, hey, distress is distress. Trying to tease apart which one came first with anxiety and depression can also be pretty strange. But if you've got panic attacks, of course it's depressing. If you're anxious all the time, of course that's depressing. And if you're depressed all the time and can't get out of bed, you might get a little anxious about the negative consequences of that. So it's not a wild, marvelous phenomenon or a counterintuitive notion that these are going to overlap. The fact that some of the meds also seem to be comparably effective isn't a huge surprise, but I do want to emphasize that they're not all that effective in the first place. And then I did want to bring up one over-the-counter med we alluded to when we did the over-the-counter meds, but that's St. John's Wort. Recent meta-analysis suggests that St. John's Wort really is helpful in treating mild to moderate depression, does less well once the severity has reached a higher level. It's not without its own adverse side effects, so there are definitely some GI distress. Odd fatigue, which is hard to keep in mind sometimes because it takes a couple of weeks to kick in, much like the other antidepressants, and the fatigue is still there, so it's hard to know what to attribute it to, and often folks forget they're actually taking the St. John's Wort anymore. And then this sensitivity to light that is very curious. So not just when you go outside, the light seems bright, but actually you can get some curious skin reactions. The dropout for this tends to be lower than for other medications, in part because the side effects aren't as aversive. And it's not like every single St. John's Wort that you get at the gas station is going to be necessarily a powerful one. There's certainly a case to be made for some of the tinctures and some of the ones that are a little closer to nature and more natural, but those data haven't been a top priority for any investigators either. I know there's some other over-the-counter things that make it here and there about depression and the occasional discussion of some kind of vitamin deficiency. Yeah, we often see B12 or vitamin D lower in depressed clients than in other clients, but it's unclear if that's just a product of the poor eating habits and the loss of appetite. And generally the interventions where they literally apply, they make people take those vitamins, haven't been all that impressive. I kind of wish it were that simple. That'd be a nice intervention, but it just doesn't seem to happen. And with that in mind, just because it is a plant doesn't mean St. John's Wort is markedly better than anything else on Earth. As we've discussed, there are mushrooms that are toxic. There are plenty of hemlock-related plants that are really, really lethal. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's harmless. Oh, and here's an intriguing image of the plant itself. So with this in mind, I do want to get into some of the cognitive distortions from cognitive behavior therapy. And if you happen to be taking an exam with me, I'm going to, give an example of one of these and just ask you about a particular thought fitting a certain category. The discriminative validity on these is rather terrible. They do kind of overlap, and I often overgeneralize them anyway, which is kind of dichotomous. But we essentially have categories of ways that our thoughts can be maladaptive or just not serve us well. And once you understand the categories, you find it's easier to identify when your thoughts are leading you astray. Once you have fine distinctions on anything, you can identify them well. If you've made pancakes and done it a few times and practiced with it, you have these subtle distinctions about when the bubbles are up and that's when I want to turn and I know this pan, things like that. Get to know your own mind with that kind of familiarity, and you can intervene yourself. And more than anything, I like that the meta message is, let's not take our thoughts too seriously. My friend Jack Huntington is a psychologist down in DC, and he has that bumper sticker, don't believe everything you think, right? Thoughts are going to come and go. They're going to pop inside your head. Again, let's test them out. Let's see if they're helpful or not. They aren't capital T truth just because they ended up in your noggin. So one of my favorite categories, what a surprise, is jumping to conclusions, right? And this is a cognitive distortion where you decide you know the capital T truth based on limited information and without checking it out, and then you believe it, and then of course it ends up bumming you out. So two categories on this. One of my personal favorites, mind reading. So, the dean didn't email me back because she hates me. Right? Obviously, I'm trying to read the mind of someone who's not even there and assume all kinds of things about my own importance and the dean's affect, when in fact there are multiple explanations for why I might not have had an email returned. Don't have anything to do with me or anybody's feeling at all, but we seem to think, particularly during depressive episodes, we know exactly why everyone is behaving the way they behave. It's because they secretly despise us, right? And the other example of jumping to conclusions is this fortune-telling error. Some people call it crystal balling it, right? Oh, I know I shouldn't even bother applying for that job because I'm not going to get it anyway, right? Well, how could you possibly know if you don't apply? Plenty of times you'll catch folks literally going out into the future, already deciding there's going to be a negative consequence or a negative outcome simply because they've got that negative filter on and really take that for true and of course end up feeling sad about it. And you can see how this could, if not generate a depressive episode, at least make it harder to shake it off. All or nothing thinking, another category, or as I've been calling it, dichotomous thinking. My mom used to call this the Rosanna Dana model. If it ain't one thing, it's the other. Literally, everything is either completely black or completely white. If you're not a winner, you're a loser, right? Either this is going to be awesome or it's completely dreadful. There was a movie out in the 70s, and the tagline was, second best is the same as last, right? That's not true. Second best is not the same as last, right? When you lose the distinctions, the fine gradations, the gray areas, this is, again, invitation to depressive thinking and can maintain or even generate a depressive episode. The mental filter is a tougher one to intervene on, but a good one to be aware of, and that's that certain negative things don't even reach your consciousness sometime because of the biases you have in the way you process information. And if you could see me now, I'm holding my fingers over my face as if only so much light is allowed to reach me. I gave this example from some research I'd done showing certain cognitive schemata, certain ways of processing information that was consistent with alcohol consumption. It also works with anxiety and depression. So remember, I had folks define words, and they had words like shot and toast and spirit, right? And folks who were heavy drinkers said, oh, shot, that's 1.5 ounces of liquor. And toast, that's when you clink your glasses. And spirits, that's, vodka, stuff like that, right? When in fact, people who were not heavy drinkers think of toast as, cooked bread that you have for breakfast. And a shot is something you get at the doctor when you're having medication. And spirits are, woo, spirits. So obviously the way those folks interpreted those ambiguous stimuli is also common to depression. Folks who get an ambiguous sentence like, the doctor was impressed with Mary's growth, right? Now, some people say, oh, Mary used to be only 4'2" and now she's 4'6", and the doctor was really impressed. And other people are like, oh my God, she's got a tumor, right? This interpretation of of ambiguous stimuli in a negative way is obviously a contributor to a bad mood, and that mental filter is something you can at least start asking yourself about, even though it has a certain automaticity about it. It ends up getting in there so quickly. And just a good thing to keep in mind if you happen to be living with someone who's having a depressive episode as well. A few more of these, and just want you to sort of recognize them if you saw them. So we've got another set of cognitive distortions includes maximizing and minimizing. You guys have heard me use the expression catastrophizing. So you maximize any negative event, right? Oh my God, this is the worst thing ever. And then the next thought is, and it's always going to be this way, right? And it's going to apply to the entire world. And it's all about me, right? So to suddenly take one small event and think it's essentially the worst thing ever. In contrast, the minimizing, so something good happens and you literally assume it is not at all big. So any evidence of your own strengths or a memory of a good event tends to get minimized. There are memory-related biases with depressed mood in particular. So I did this in grad school, basically have people read a story after they've had a sad mood induced, and even though there's an equal number of happy, neutral, and sad events in the story, when you ask them later what happened, they come up with markedly more of the negative events than they do the positive or even the neutral. How do you battle this? Well, again, look for the data. Is this really a complete disaster? Is this the hugest catastrophe ever? The next step is emotional reasoning, and man, this is a tough one as well. So essentially, folks go with the idea that if I feel it, therefore it must be so. Right? And in the abstract there, it doesn't sound so bad, but just because you feel it is not confirmation. You don't have a pipeline to the truth on this. So you say, oh man, I feel like I'm terrible, so I must be terrible, right? Oh, it's just a hard way to go out and live in the world. But this notion that if I'm angry, therefore what this person has done is bad, right? And trying to reason from affect is just a way to maintain affect and may have nothing to do with three-dimensional reality. Downplaying the positive, so this one's not perfectly distinguished from minimizing, but basically something good will happen and you use an alternative explanation for it. So David Burns talks about a client of his who thinks she's the biggest loser while she's an inpatient, and then when she leaves, other patients there and the staff and the nurses and everybody talk about how great she really was, and then she says, oh, well, they didn't know me in the real world. They just knew me in the hospital, right? So it's like there's an alternative explanation for anything positive, and you downplay any positive feedback. A friend of mine who's actually an adolescent psychiatrist now, we were reading for a service at Temple, and some woman came up and praised him, said he had done a good job, and she walked away, and under his breath he said, she's probably deaf. Right? He was bummed out at the time, and that certainly didn't do much to help him shake it off. Right? In addition to downplaying the positive, we have should statements, and this does overlap with Albert Ellis's set of cognitions that can be maladaptive. And should, must, or ought all pretty much get us into a situation where we're making demands of ourselves, often trying to like whip ourselves into some kind of motivation or better mood, when in fact it's just not true. Other than, breathing and eating, what do I really must do? What should I do? And Ellis calls it masturbation. And every time I put that on the exam and that's the right answer, everybody thinks I'm joking around. So do it this time, and by all means, if you see masturbation, odds are high it really is the correct answer. So some of my 12-step buddies say, and you shouldn't should on yourself, or basically playing off that. Labeling, generally anytime you're going to try to label your entire self or your entire life, or apply a label to you as if it is your identity, that is a tough one, and it's often ends up being a negative one, when in fact odds are high you're a multifaceted person with some strengths and some weaknesses, as we all have, right? Instead of, I'm a loser, or you don't perform as well as you'd like in some sporting event, and you go, that's because I stink, right? These labels, as if they are character traits or things that cannot be altered, that's never going to be adaptive. And just see if you catch yourself doing it. Often that's going to be a contributor to negative mood or a depressive episode. Overgeneralization, you usually take a single incident or a single example and essentially make it mean more than it should, as if it applied to every single thing that's ever going to happen in your life. So some small negative event happens, and you end up seeing it as this never-ending pattern of defeat, if you will. So, the dice roll and you don't get the number you want, and you say, oh man, that's just what always happens to me, right? In fact, rolling the dice is completely independent of who you are. No need to overgeneralize. And this notion that once one bad thing has happened, it's going to be that way forever is another variation on overgeneralization. And finally, we've got personalization. I gotta admit, there are times when I actually call this one over-personalization. You see yourself as the cause of some negative thing, when in fact there's really no way you could be responsible for it. So my favorite example is the personal rainstorm, right? I wash my car, so of course it's going to rain. Now, of course, I never wash my car, but if that were an incident where I'm making something personal that clearly I could not have had any impact, I assure you I do not have control over the weather simply by washing my car. Now, these sound almost delusional, and in fact, with extreme depressive symptoms, you'll see folks who really grab onto these and swear they're true and don't often accept any counter evidence. And if that's the case, then we have to sort of build from there. If you can't dispute it, can you at least see that it's something your mind is doing, right? Minds are going to do what minds do. Can I behave in ways that I value independent of the chatter in my head or even my negative emotions? And that's sometimes part of the hexaflex, some of the foundations in acceptance and commitment therapy. And when I've seen folks be successful with behavioral activation is literally getting in touch with your own values, scheduling your day so it's filled with events that are not only as many pleasant as possible, but an opportunity to challenge yourself or take something on that you've been putting off that's irritating you, and odds are high it's not going to be as negative as you thought it was in your head. And then you get more done. You start doing more than just lying around in bed, and the natural reinforcers in the world kind of kick in. Obviously, I'm not doing this justice, and it really does take a good 12 sessions to make this not only become a reflex in that you can identify these thoughts, but in addition, you can challenge them yourself, notice when you're doing it, even get a chuckle out of the fact that this is the way your mind works. You don't need to uncover what crazy Freudian thing might have contributed to it, but at least you understand that you're doing it, and then you become the chooser. You get to decide, I'm going to behave this way or I'm not. Given my assessment of this, understanding that my assessment is not a capital T truth. If you learn nothing else from this, it's that my thoughts are not reality. There's a distinction between what's really going on in the world, much of which I do not even know anything about, and what's going on inside my head. If you're willing to admit that maybe there's something you don't know, you're stepping in the right direction. And then with that in mind, I just want to emphasize this notion of deinstitutionalization. And Leventhal discusses this in his book. Once we started developing more of the antipsychotic meds in particular, it gave folks a lot of optimism about helping folks with psychotic disorders, but also extremes with bipolar, with the mood disorders in either direction, so that they could get out into the community instead of literally just being warehoused in some big mental hospital. Now, I gotta admit, deinstitutionalization got a bad rap because it didn't end up getting the funding it was supposed to get in order to make sure folks could really make their way in the community. But the idea was much like the work I had done, where folks who had been hospitalized for a mental illness would then have some scaffolding, have a little bit more support. So they'd live in the halfway house with me, learn some new skills, kind of get a better feel for self-care, for cooking, cleaning, and things like that, but also get in touch with some opportunities that would fill their day with activities that were going to make them not only feel good, but be proud and get things done that they needed to get done, and then gradually move to maybe a supervised apartment where, maybe there's 4 people in apartments all in the same area, where there's a person who checks in on them regularly, and they become more and more independent as these things go on. It's a great idea, but it's not just throw them out of the hospital and see them once a week at the mental health center. I really feel like there's a lot to be done here. I know I'm a little bit negative about the way both depression and psychotherapy, both antidepressants and psychotherapy have succeeded in the literature. Some of you know I've been working in that psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy world right now. What can we really expect? 65% of folks who go into therapy and really, give it their all definitely are going to get better, but we've got to find something new. My thought was, hey, if the psychedelics really do lead to improved mood and a little bit of delight right away, unlike the antidepressant meds, that's the big opportunity then to get in for psychotherapy, learn some of these new skills, be able to identify cognitions, be able to behave in ways that are consistent with values. And before that psychedelic experience wears off, and it's not that you're actively having a psychedelic experience anymore, but some of the good mood that is often associated with that wears off, there's a chance to get another dose, but also have the natural reinforcers in life kick in. We see this in religious use, ritualistic use of ayahuasca, peyote, and things like that. So it's like every full moon, folks go and kind of revisit, remember their connection to some bigger community and maybe even some bigger universe, get out, start outlining their lives that are consistent with their values again, and revisit at regular intervals. This notion that depression in particular is anything other than a chronic relapsing condition has been the problem. You can't do one size fits all. It's not like a hernia. You can't just go in and have surgery and then have it be done. Right? if we can start thinking about this as a process instead of a one-shot silver bullet, we're bound to do better. I can't thank you enough for listening to this part. Really appreciate your attention. I'll have this posted. If you have any questions, feel free to put them underneath this video here on YouTube, or email me. The public email 420research@gmail.com is also open. That's the numbers 420research@gmail.com. Stay strong. Follow your heart and let the data be your guide.